ተዋህዶ መሸሸጊያዬ ኦርቶዶክስ መጠለያዬ ሰላምሽ ከፍ ይበልልኝ እናቴ ሁሌም ኖሪልኝ ሰላምሽ ከፍ ይበልልኝ እናቴ ሁሌም ኖሪልኝ።
We are Orthodox Christians, which means I really don't care whether you're Catholic, Presbyterian, Baptist, Pentecostal, Methodist, whatever. Too many Catholics don't know Christ. Too many Protestants don't know Christ. The issue is simply not are you Catholic or Protestant. The issue is how have you responded to Jesus Christ. I'm concerned, how have you responded to the person of Jesus Christ? And that, I would argue, is the Orthodox Christian faith.
Father, were you always Orthodox? How did you get into Orthodoxy?
I was raised in a devout Lutheran family, a conservative confessional Lutheran family, if that makes any sense. In other words, the group that we were part of, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, was more toward the Reformation than some of the larger Lutheran groups that are existent today. I went through Lutheran elementary school, Lutheran high school, Lutheran college, Lutheran seminary, graduated Lutheran seminary with 2 degrees, a Master's of Divinity, and then later an STM, a Master's of Sacred Theology, and was serving as a Lutheran pastor for 16 years when I determined that I could no longer be Lutheran. I was serving for 11 years in a Lutheran church in inner city Detroit. And when I announced to the leadership that I could no longer be the Lutheran pastor they wanted it to be, what really attracted me to the Orthodox Church was the asceticism, the practice of discipline, self-control, self-discipline, in terms of prayer, in terms of fasting, in terms of just the entire life. When I became convinced that I could no longer be a Lutheran pastor, what was driving me is that I had to be Orthodox more than anything else, including more than the house, the income, the health care, the pension plan, those things that I walked away from when I determined I had to leave the Lutheran Church.
I became a pastor in a Pentecostal church for 5 years. From there, I started moving towards my way into the Coptic Orthodox Church. And I like to think this is where I'm going to spend the rest of my life, but I'd rather just say I'm going to spend the rest of my life chasing after Christ, getting to know Him better and receiving Him and conforming myself to Him by taking up my cross and following Him the best that I can.
So growing up, I went to youth groups on and off through a non-denominational church, and but at the same time, I still had the wherewithal to start up a Bible study in my chapter. Deep down, I knew that there was something about the Christian faith that was important to me. I just didn't know how, or it was challenging without examples around me. And so I had one foot in the world and had certainly not surrendered to Christ at this point. Sin still permeated throughout my life. And once I reached my junior year, I had a really severe anxiety attack on a plane on the way home from spring break. And, I didn't really deal with anxiety. And so an old friend of mine from high school had moved to the same city and invited me to a Vesper service. And so Orthodoxy was still so foreign to me, and unlike anything I'd ever seen, and I went purely for the sake of tourism, but I found myself captivated by the beauty of this tradition. And I went home thinking that it was too strange for me to ever take seriously. However, when discussing theology with my roommates, I began to find myself referencing the Orthodox as a position of authority. I did genuinely revere the Orthodox faith for its beauty and seriousness, and after more discussions with my roommates, one of them actually proposed, why don't you convert to Orthodoxy? And I never seriously considered it because it seemed like an impossible avenue to pursue given how different it was. But ultimately, I took this advice and attended that church again, the Orthodox church again. And so it took a few months for me to return a second time. However, upon returning, I found myself yet again captivated by the liturgy. I met some of the folks in the Orthodoxy 101 class, the Catechism class, and they invited me to join them. And still, I didn't return for a few weeks until I ran into one of them at the gym. So we sat and discussed our qualms with the different churches we visited and how we both felt a draw to Orthodoxy. And after that conversation, I decided to return and regularly attend the Catechism class. And at this point, I was still somewhat skeptical. Simultaneously, I was watching a lot of Orthodox priests on YouTube. Lust had been a continuous struggle of mine, and it was probably the most damaging sin in my life. And I had minimal success applying tactics to conquer it. Father Moses, the Russian Orthodox priest, based out of Austin, Texas, made a video explaining that the minute we feel temptation, we must make the sign of the cross and recite the Jesus prayer. And for the first time in what felt like ages, I was making strides in combating lustful thoughts. And the effectiveness of Father Moses' instructions showed me that there's a lot that I can learn from the Orthodox tradition and reinforce the reality of the spiritual world that, my previous pastor had touched on. And I was like, wow, he's planted all these seeds in me, and what to look for in a church, and I felt like I had come across them in Orthodoxy. And it just reinforced the reality of the spiritual world and that there was great power in the name of Jesus Christ. And that being said, I think that my journey to Orthodoxy is different than most men. I like to consider myself a creative person. I'm not necessarily artsy, but I love art, if that makes sense.
I used to be a Protestant. I was a Protestant youth pastor. Took a very circuitous route, and ended up really, I made pit stops in every apostolic tradition you could along the way. But we'll get into that. Eventually made my way home into the Coptic Church.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
And one guy says, "Do you know anything about the Orthodox Church?" I said, "What about it?" He goes, "Well, one of my kids is on a soccer team, and they're Greek Orthodox." And I said, "Well, I'm not Greek, so I've never been to a Greek Orthodox church." And he said, "Well, this dad, it kind of irritates me. Like, he talks that this is the true faith, but he's not trying to evangelize me. He's not trying to convince me to become Orthodox. But he's a very peaceful, patient man. So I'll ask him for something. We'll read it."
So what do you guys do at this point? You've read the book.
So keep in mind, this is like a non-denominational Pentecostal-ish church. One of the worship pastor is really good friends with a retired priest from the OCA, Orthodox Church in America, Father Theo. Father Theo he was retired. He would show up to our church on a Sunday morning in his cassock, and he would sit in the front row. And we're like, who is this guy? Yeah. Father Theo is the most Orthodox priest. God bless him. I love that man. So eventually we're like, we know a guy who knows an Orthodox priest. So we go in his office, we shut the door. "Eric, tell us everything you know about Orthodoxy." He's like, "Why are you asking me this?" And I told him. He said, "Listen, I've flirted with this for 20 years. Am I gonna go Orthodox and stay where I am?" And Father Theo's walked with me through all that. And he said, "Just be the best Christian you can be where you are."
So Eric is the pastor?
He's the worship pastor. Because if you guys really want to do this, we gotta do it right. We're gonna go to the monastery. I said, "Sure." So my first experience in an Orthodox service was Great Vespers at a Romanian Orthodox monastery.
Wow.
That was kind of like it, It's like, this is it. This is heaven. And all the icons on the walls. I mean, I'm still uncomfortable with some of this stuff at the time. I'm uncomfortable with iconography, and I'm like, "If you want to go venerate the icons," like, no, thank you, I'm good.
I'm gonna get struck by lightning.
Yeah. And so we asked them, "How do you know all this theology, all this great stuff?" I go to church a lot, I read my Bible, and say You're saying that's how you learn theology? You didn't none of you nuns have a theology degree? No. Right. And that reminds me of this funny saying. So, you familiar with Father Thomas Hopko? Eastern Orthodox priest. He had this saying: "You can't know God, but you have to know Him to know Him." Yes. Love that. And so I just went and became Orthodox on my own.
We have now clearly understood that both families, that is the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox, have always loyally maintained the same authentic Orthodox Christological faith and the unbroken continuity of the apostolic tradition, though they have used Christological terms in different ways. That clarity of understanding was not reached until over 1,500 years after the schism.
ዘረኝነት ችግር ካንቺ እንዲጠፋ የአባቶች ልመና ይሆንሻል ተስፋ የአባቶች ልመና ይሆንሻል ተስፋ ገብረ መንፈስ ቅዱስ የጸለየልሽ የአምላክ ምስክሮች ዛሬም አሉልሽ የአምላክ ምስክሮች ዛሬም አሉልሽ ተዋህዶ መሸሸጊያዬ ኦርቶዶክስ መጠለያዬ ሰላምሽ ከፍ ይበልልኝ እናቴ ሁሌም ኖሪልኝ ሰላምሽ ከፍ ይበልልኝ ታሪክሽን ያቆዩ ብዙ አባቶች አሉ። ታሪክሽን ያቆዩ ብዙ አባቶች አሉ። ደማቸውን ፈሶ ስላንቺ የሞቱ አሉ አባቶቻችን በእምነት የበረቱ አሉ አባቶቻችን በእምነት የበረቱ። ተዋህዶ መሸሸጊያዬ ኦርቶዶክስ መጠለያዬ ሰላምሽ ከፍ ይበልልኝ እናቴ ሁሌም ነው